Hi, everyone, and welcome to The X, a podcast from inside Silicon Valley about how experience shapes everything from products to businesses to entire industries. I'm Brian McLean, and I'm here with Demetrius Madrigal. Today, we're going to discuss a topic that's not widely addressed in the media, but we've been researching here at The X for some time: how technology and artificial intelligence are disrupting the entire filmmaking process in Hollywood. Good morning, Dee. Question of the day. What was the last non-Marvel film you watched?
Well, actually, we just watched Nobody over the weekend. I don't know if you're familiar with that movie.
No, how was it?
It was great. It's kind of a guilty pleasure. It's not Citizen Kane, but it's really well made. It's a lot of fun. It's very clever. It's kind of like John Wick meets like Breaking Bad,
Ooh.
meets, I don't know what the other example would be, but you throw in something fun to mix that all up, and that's what you got.
As much as I love all these action superhero movies and stuff, it's nice to hear about films that come out that are completely different. Like that, when you described like John Wick meets, Breaking Bad, it's like, oh, that's so exciting. I want to see that.
This is not completely different.
Oh, really?
It's actually highly derivative, but in a fun, interesting kind of way. And it's got like Christopher Lloyd's in it and stuff. Like it brings back, and like the main actor is Bob Odenkirk from Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul, right? So it's not like AAA actor in their box office draw. They went with the right guy for the role. They had some great direction to it. It's an action film, so you wouldn't think a comedian like Bob Odenkirk would be like, oh, hey, he's the new Arnold Schwarzenegger or something. But like he pulls it off pretty well.
That's awesome. Yeah, this topic today is super compelling to me because we've had this discussion many times how technology tends to like eat up industries. Technology tends to enhance industries. This one is really interesting because Hollywood in general has been such a creative outlet for the world for so long, and now what we're seeing is that the creative aspects of it are still there, but there's a lot of technology being deployed to help build and create these massive franchises and films. What's your general thought on the introduction of technology into Hollywood and kind of the things that we're seeing these days?
From a production standpoint, the technology is helping to get movies made that were not possible before, right? We know that from the introduction of CG and all these kinds of things. If you compare like what's in like Thor Ragnarok versus what's in Flash Gordon, it's just a world of difference. So you can make those kinds of movies that couldn't be made at a level of quality previously. Now, when you get into kind of the work process, Netflix has kind of introduced the idea of using data and analytics in order to kind of inform your process. But there's a danger to that. And we know this from we've been working with data our entire careers. And there's always a right way and a wrong way to use the data. So if they use the data appropriately, you use it to inform the right decisions, you can make some great choices. But if you either don't have a great understanding of the data, if the data is bad, that's one thing that everybody misses, right? That saying that goes around that some data is better than no data is absolutely wrong. What we tell people is no data is better than bad data. Because if you have data that's leading you, that is inaccurate, it's leading you to a wrong decision, it's better to not have it, because then you have a false crutch.
Let's talk a little bit about Netflix for a second. So when Netflix first started streaming and people started signing on, a lot of people talked about at the time was, there's so much content here. There's so much to look at. How do I find what I'm looking for? And then over time, Netflix kind of perfected the system to like serve you up options and ideas for things that you might be interested in. And what that actually is doing is it's actually analyzing viewing patterns of millions of subscribers on a regular basis. So how long does Bryan sit there and watch? What does he typically look for? How long does it take him to find something? When we serve up something that is surfing related or Star Wars related or anything like that, how quickly does he act on that information and find something to watch? every little detail of your behavior is being analyzed. Well, the reverse of that is basically, okay, well, if you have millions and millions of people and you can analyze the behavior of them on the platform, then you can flip it inside out and say, now I kind of have enough information to determine what I need to make in order to make those people happy. So, what type of films should I produce in order to keep people on the platform? So, a great example of that would be, okay, if 30% of the people who watch comedies always watch an Adam Sandler show or Adam Sandler movie, then maybe we should hire Adam Sandler to make 10 more films for us. And more specifically, they tend to like the ones where Adam Sandler is in a different location, such as Hawaii or Africa. Oh, and by the way, they love it when he has a super hilarious co-star. Oh, by the way, they always love it when his best friends are involved in the films, like David Spade. Suddenly, it just starts compounding to the point where, from a creativity standpoint, you're basically outlining all of this criteria prior to even coming up with something creatively, right? And that to me is a real interesting way of looking at film creation, because it's like the complete opposite of what was done, let's say, 40 or 50 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, they kind of tried to do this 40 or 50 years ago, but they didn't have the data, right? They would say, I mean, what puts us 40 or 50 years ago? We're looking at, Humphrey Bogart, right? They're like, well, Humphrey Bogart is the biggest box office draw. People love Humphrey Bogart. We're going to put Humphrey Bogart in all of our movies. And that works to some extent. But if you're trying to apply the data, that's like I said before, sometimes it leads people into false assumptions because they don't understand it, right? They're looking at it like, oh, well, people really like having Adam Sandler in a movie, so we're going to put him in a movie. What really matters is Adam Sandler was in a movie and it was good and it was funny and it was relatable. And those aren't things that are necessarily the easiest to quantify. There are methodologies for doing that. We know methodologies for doing that, but not everybody does. And they'll look at things like, oh, hey, look, Deadpool is an R-rated superhero movie and it made a bunch of money. We're going to go ahead and greenlight a bunch of R-rated superhero movies. Well, it doesn't really work like that, right? Deadpool worked because it was funny. It leaned into kind of the tone of the source material. It had some authenticity in its production. All of these things that is much more difficult to quantify. But if you can, you get into the real truth behind things. So that's one of the challenges I think that Hollywood is going to have to get over is like, I have all this data. How do I make sense of it in order to make the right decisions?
Yeah, I mean, this even goes back to Bill Burr, the comedian. I don't know if you remember, but he did an interview, and one of the things that he talked about was his experience of going into Netflix for the first time when they wanted to talk to him about doing a comedy show on their network.
That's his F is for Family show, right?
No, it was either that one or one of his main specials. But he said you go into the room and you're talking to them and they're like, yeah, so we think you should do this. This would be really interesting. And he said they have like all this data. He said not all of it is shared with him, but they give him basically the highlights of like, this is how many millions of people will watch it. And we're pretty confident of that, 80% likelihood or whatever that all these people are going to watch your show and that kind of stuff. He said that's very different than just going out doing something and saying, oh, I really hope it works out. And then looking at the numbers 2 weeks later and going, it worked out, right? It's like you already know the answer to your question before asking it. Now, I want to be clear. We have not spoken to Netflix about this. I don't know specifically what they can and cannot do, but definitely actors and comedians have mentioned the power of what happens internally at Netflix. And one of the reasons why they actually like working with them. And to Netflix credit, every comedian I have heard on an interview talk about working with Netflix said that they give them complete control. Like they literally say, we're not comedians. You are. You tell us what's funny and we'll help you fit this in to the audience, right? And so as everything moves to streaming, I almost feel like the conversation is always going to be, okay, nice proposal for this film, this show, this animated series, whatever, but let's project first how it's going to do with the audience before we actually produce it. And I don't know that that's always the right way to do it, but if you're running a business and you're trying to maximize profits, it seems like that would be the right way to do it from a business perspective, not considering anything related to the creative side, right?
Yeah, I mean, if you can accurately predict, and that's the part of the question, right? Because there are plenty of movies that they got the prediction wrong. I already mentioned Deadpool. Nobody expected it to make the kind of money that it made. Then you look at the original Joss Whedon Justice League, and that was predicted to make probably double or more what it actually made at the box office. So that's one thing to keep in mind. One of the is that your predictions, like anything, are they can be right, they might be wrong. The other part of it is it probably generally shouldn't be used to pick which movies to green light. If anything, it's more like a litmus test of like, all right, we're going to make a big, very expensive film with these characteristics. What's our prediction? And if we believe we can break even or make money on it, it's fine. But it shouldn't be the other way around. Probably shouldn't be, hey, if we assemble these different components, we can Frankenstein together $1 billion movie. That is probably going to not work out. You're going to end up with Tom Cruise as the Mummy at that point.
That was very nice of you, by the way.
Hey, I appreciate many Tom Cruise's movies. The Mummy was not a great choice.
I will tell you, I'm very excited about the new Top Gun coming out. I'm pretty stoked about that.
I'm interested, but I'm like, I mean, what's the story going to be? Like, who are we fighting in the air? Does ISIS all of a sudden have some fighter jets? I don't think they do.
I don't know. It'll be interesting. I'm not going to read too much about it. I want to just watch it.
Yeah, we'll check it out.
I was hoping that they would just stream it. I don't know if they're going to do that or not.
I'm sad that Tony Scott isn't around to make the sequel himself. That would have been the icing on the cake, but I'm interested. I'm definitely interested in seeing what's going on.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you this. It is not just Netflix that's getting into this game of analytics either. So I was digging around, and Vox had done some reporting on this in 2020. And basically, Warner Brothers recently announced a deal with Synlytic. I think it's called Synlytic. It's a startup in Los Angeles that uses algorithms and data to predict a film's success before the film is made or even greenlit. Basically, on their site, this is what they're saying. It's the only end-to-end self-service data analytics and predictive intelligence platform in the entertainment industry. They use groundbreaking AI-powered predictive forecasting intelligence to get up to 85% accuracy before a film is made. What do you think about that?
Well, I mean, they really nailed a lot of the buzzwords, right? So whoever is putting together their SEO has done a great job. On the other side of it, I'd say if this can be accurate and they are being responsible, then they can be very helpful within the process, right? There's the challenge is there's always an urge to use the data inappropriately. Like people will always ask us in our work of like, well, does this mean we can do this? I'm like, no, it doesn't mean that you're safe by doing that. You can do that and see what happens. But the data to use the data in that way is kind of stretching what the data is actually saying. So it's the same thing with this. Like I said before, if somebody's using this to tell me who the best actor is for this movie, that's probably not going to be helpful. It's going to get them into trouble. Well, if they're saying like, hey, I need to clear X amount in order for this movie to make sure it's not losing everything for me. Like I have to have enough of a box office draw in order to make sure that this movie is actually getting seen and I'm not popping out a bomb because it doesn't have enough appeal. Then it can be a nice check to make sure like, okay, well, I need somebody somewhere in this, or I need something somewhere in this in order to bump up the appeal in order to make sure that I can break even.
Well, in that same reporting, it did say that Warner Brothers states this technology is for marketing and distribution, and it would not be used to like select actors or make other creative decisions. I think that's what they were getting at. Think about this though. Let's say you have a roster of actors that you want to have on your film, and you've interviewed them, you've seen their work, and you've decided, I think this is great. I mean, it kind of feels like obvious that if you have this platform, you're going to go in and enter their names or whatever and just kind of see how it connects with the data, right? So
Yeah.
like if, Demetrius is going to be the lead actor and I type in Demetrius and it says 85% chance that you will be successful with this particular actor, it just
Mhm.
kind of confirms this decision that's about to be made where you're going to write, a check for sometimes 10, 20, 30 million dollars to this particular actor in
Mhm.
order to lead your vision of this movie. So I don't see how these studios are going to like not double check or use this data to kind of like verify decisions that
Yeah.
they're currently making. You know what I mean? To say like,
Yeah.
oh, I'm not going to use it for this, it just kind of seems. I kind
I
of
mean,
feel like everyone will.
I agree it can be useful. So for Warner Brothers to say that is interesting to me because they definitely have allowed the marketing and distribution to interfere with the creative process before. So the original Suicide Squad movie was a well-known example where they put out a trailer that was very inspired by Guardians of the Galaxy, and then everybody loved the trailer, so they went back in and took the guys who made the trailer and made them the editors for the movie.
Uh-huh.
And that ended up kind of Frankensteining the movie together, and because it shifted the tone and did all these kinds of things. So that's a famous example of that. When it comes to kind of some of the ways that you can use this, especially when it comes to an actor, is if you want to cast, let's say, Scarlett Johansson, right, in a movie, because you think, all right, this is going to help me drum up enough interest within the market that this movie is going to get enough attention, it's going to make enough money, where it's not just going to kind of disappear into the void. You can do the analysis and say, well, here's how much the movie is going to make. This is how much brand awareness that Scarlett Johansson can we expect to bring to this. As a result of that, then the contract that we would try to get to is X amount of dollars. So you can take that to Scarlett Johansson and her people and say, we really want you for this movie. I think you want to do this movie too because of the creative characteristics of the movie itself. But here's what we can pay you, and here is why. Then that can be helpful, right? That's can be like, all right, well, I'm not just trying to talk you down from your asking price for the hell of it. I'm doing it because our data shows that in order for the movie to be a success, or at least to break even, or to limit our losses, if it's going to be like a prestige picture, which Hollywood used to do, they used to, and they still do. They put out movies that they know they're going to lose money on it because it's going to win awards or get critical attention, which will raise the profile of the studio in general, and then just indirectly help them sell all their other movies. But getting into or just having knowledge of how much money they can expect to gain or lose can really help them when it comes to just contract negotiations with these actors, or maybe selecting another actor who might have similar draw but is not as expensive. Same thing with the creative team. Maybe they can get another editor who doesn't cost as much, who is a similar style. You can look for budget for deals in certain ways in order to kind of keep things within a certain budget.
Although I will counter that and say, in tech, we've seen it where you cut the budget so much around certain areas that suddenly the output isn't great, right? Like that, it's a weird balance. It's like you want to have a tight budget and a small team that's very creative and developing this product or developing this film. But then if you like cut it too much, it doesn't turn out great. If you put too much money into it, then people aren't as creative sometimes. It's this weird balance. And I'm not sure that data and analytics can really help you find the perfect balance. It could just kind of guide you. I mean, you're really good about always educating people we work with and saying, use this data as a guide. Don't always use the data as like the end all be all for making decisions. Just use it as a guide. Like, I think I want to make this decision. The data indicates I'm correct. So I think I'm going to make that decision.
Yeah.
Not the data said to do this, so I'm just going to do it.
You can do what you want to do, but the data should inform you what the consequences of that choice is going to be. Doesn't mean you can't do it, but you might have to compensate for that in other areas. Now, you bring up a great point, because the things that when we work on things and they don't work out, a lot of times it comes down to just the budget or the schedule was never right on from the beginning, right? So a product got rushed out because when the original scheduling was put together, it just turned out to be off, or it wasn't realistic for whatever reason. So I think that's one of the areas where analytics in film production can have their biggest impact, is if analytics can look at, all right, here's the type of film that's being made, here's where the script is in its process. Here's where the amount of effect shots it's going to need, just in general. It can help to dial in, like, you guys are thinking X amount of dollars for the budget. Our analysis is showing it's going to be closer to Y. So now you can account for that. Same thing with the schedule. Is you guys are thinking that's going to be in this schedule. And this happens for us in our work all the time, is that we tell people, look, your schedule's not going to work. It's just not. You're going to need to push it out and change it in this way or that way in order to make all this stuff fit together. Now in Hollywood, if you can do that ahead of time and process it, you save so much money from not having to shift the schedule that it's a lot of times it's better to plan out that schedule in the first place and save the money from having to extend it later, because just making that extension costs so much more money. You've got to renegotiate your leases on equipment. You've got to get people out of other commitments. You've got to do all kinds of work in order to make it still fit within the schedule that you have, or you rush it and end up with a bad product.
As I think about all this stuff, though, and I think about all the data and how we're applying it all, I just wonder, though, if you apply it too much, if you end up losing some of those creative films that have become like cult classics, like The Big Lebowski, for example, right? Like, I don't think there's any system that would have said, you should make a film with these particular people about this particular topic.
Well, I disagree, man. I mean, you're looking at, all right, Big Lebowski, right? You got the Coen brothers, you got John Goodman, you got Steve Buscemi, you've got these well-liked, iconic actors. The chances of it not turning into a cult film are pretty far out there. And then you look at how much it costs to make The Big Lebowski. I mean, maybe the prosthetic toe was expensive, but like overall, it's a pretty cheap movie. And the amount of brand awareness and just the regard for the brand that movie has returned for the filmmakers and the actors, and I assume to some extent the studio, has been immeasurable. Every time I see a meme that says you're out of your depth, Donnie, I'm like, okay, yeah, Big Lebowski just got paid off again in another way.
Well, here's the thing. Let me be clear about what I'm saying here. Mm-hmm. So I think any automated system is going to look at it and, of course, say those particular actors and those particular directors are very high end. Put them all together, something good will happen. But if you look at that script, and you look at that story, that comes from the minds of very creative and interesting people. I just don't think that we are in a state of technology right now where you can have a system pretty much automatically write that script or tell you in summary, this is what you should be doing, because that was a very interesting storyline.
Yeah. If the question is whether or not you're going to have AI systems that are going to tell you what to do and make your decisions for you, no, that's not how it's going to work. And it's not how it should work.
Well, I think the big concern has been from day one, if you talk to anyone who's a more traditional kind of Hollywood person, they'll say, my concern is, not that they're saying it's going to happen, but my concern is more technology and more data gets applied to filmmaking, that suddenly these avant-garde creative endeavors tend to get pushed out, or they get pushed into a new area, right? Like I see them. Yeah. Oh, well, let's put it this way. I counter my own argument because to some extent, I feel like the big studios producing these might get limited, right? So maybe big studios are not pumping their money into these avant-garde creative endeavors as much, right? But at the same time, though, there's this beautiful rise of success among long tail approaches because of things like YouTube and other locations where you don't even need a studio anymore. If you can get the funding in order to produce the film, you can just drop it on YouTube and have millions of people watching it.
Yeah, I've heard people make this argument before, and honestly, the data doesn't support it. If you look at the number of movies that have been produced per year, between 2001 and 2018, when we saw the rise of streaming, the number of produced films has doubled. So you had something in the order of 350 in 2001, and you're close to 900 produced films in 2018.
Yeah.
So what I think is happening here, and I don't necessarily have the data to know that what's driving their decisions around this, is because, number one, the number of films that public consume is not limited by a box office distribution method, right? So it's not limited by how many cinema theaters there are. then they can release more films. You're also not paying for pressing or burning DVDs and Blu-rays, right? You're just putting it out digitally. So the distribution method has allowed for more films to go out. And that's not even counting the amateur stuff that's on YouTube or Vimeo or plenty of these other platforms. These are actually produced films. The other side, if you look at what's out there for avant-garde, like you go out and watch The Lobster, The Favorite, and you're like, all right, yeah, this is avant-garde and it's getting a lot of attention and it's nominated for Oscars and things. Like it's avant-garde, I feel like what used to be considered avant-garde in the 80s and 90s when I was a kid watching movies and a huge movie fan at the time is now like passe, right? I watch like the end of The Favorite when they've got the like 5-minute rabbit montage and I'm just like, all right, I get it. Like this doesn't feel avant-garde and edgy anymore. It feels like everybody's doing this.
Well, I will say this, that I think the most interesting kind of point about what you were saying there is the fact that if you don't need the studios anymore and you don't need distribution on, the silver screen, right? Like it doesn't need to be inside of the movie theaters, it changes everything. Because right now, you can produce something, and if it's amazing, I don't care if you did it in your backyard or you did it through Warner Brothers, if you drop it online, you have the potential of hundreds of millions of people seeing your stuff. So if your goal is to produce something that you find to be interesting and creative and have as many people in the world as possible see it, your options are endless. And the power is not in the hands of the studios anymore. It kind of reminds me a little bit of like Kickstarter and stuff like that. Everyone started talking about how, oh, you're taking the power away from the venture capitalist, right? The VCs are going to put their money into big bets, right? Things that they hope are going to explode, but you could still be an individual, create something interesting, put it online and make millions and millions of dollars in sales on your interesting product idea, even if it's long tail, right?
Yeah.
So I feel like the market is kind of opening up, but I do see and I do understand and I do hear when people talk to us, because we talk to a lot of people about film, of their concern of Hollywood just transforming into just this machine that wants to produce the same thing over and over again because they have clear metrics to indicate that they're just going to make a ton of money, which you and I disagreed on this a little bit. And I said, hey, look, I love the things that come out of Disney. I think they're beautiful and they're interesting and they're always done really, really well. But a lot of the things that they choose are things that I see and I go, yeah, of course, millions of people are going to watch this, right? Meaning they're not investing into some obscure script that was given to them. They're producing things that they know large sums of people are going to love, right?
Well, I would disagree. And thinking back historically, you look at Marvel, right? And they historically have not, especially early on, they didn't go out there and cast the big box office draws, right? They didn't have their biggest IP. They weren't making X-Men and Fantastic Four and Spider-Man movies. They took Iron Man, which everybody was like, Iron Man. All right, I guess. And Robert Downey Jr., who was almost completely out of the industry. And I think the biggest actor they had in Iron Man was probably Gwyneth Paltrow. And then they started putting movies out and they ended up developing these guys. They threw in, you have Chris Hemsworth, which is a big star now, but he wasn't when they cast him. They had Taika. They took the Thor franchise and gave it to Taika Waititi, who's a big star now, but he wasn't at the time. People might have seen like Hunt for the Wilder People, but it didn't make $1 billion at the box office. Same thing with the Russo brothers, who are now the biggest, most successful directors in the world because the work that they did and they earned with both the Avengers movies and the last two Captain America movies. But they came from TV. They were known for doing Community and other TV shows, right? So I think Marvel has done a great job of saying, hey, we're going to flip this process on its head. We're not necessarily going to make all the biggest IP. We're going to make Guardians of the Galaxy, which nobody's actually read as a comic book since like the 70s practically. We're going to make Eternals, which most people in the comic book world don't really know very well. Mm-hmm. But what we are going to do is we're going to take the IP that's been market tested through comics. We're going to look at them and see, okay, well, this story worked. So we're going to give it to someone who we think can do great things with it, because they are a great director, or we're going to match them up with good actors, and we're going to apply a process that allows it to work, and they tend to. So these movies have done well. And what I've heard from people in the industry is that the big difference from Marvel is that instead of the studio heads, the people running the studios, being finance people who have an understanding of the creative process, the people in control are creatives who understand the finances.
Yes, and that is a big difference. I was
Yes.
listening to an interview with, oh, who was it? I forgot. It was a little while ago, but it doesn't really matter. They made an interesting point, and they said, "I'm so glad that the days of an executive who is managing the business isn't making as many comments on my script anymore." Right? They said I would get these comments that say like, "Don't wear this watch," or I don't think these shoes are going to relate to the audience. And he said it's really not driven by anything other
Yeah.
than their general opinion. And they spend the majority of their day, the business and marketing side of things, which is very important, obviously, but they're not in the creative side, but then that they have the power to kind of add that in for whatever reason. And then it creates this whole like confusion, and then everyone's got
Mhm.
to debate it. And like they said, it's just you're seeing less and less of that now because with streaming, they have to produce stuff a little bit
Mhm.
quicker, right? People tend to get bored. They're at home, they're looking through all this stuff, they can't find something, they want new content. And number two is it just doesn't work very well. Like you should have creative
Yeah.
people helping other creative people. And the ones that you said are creative and have a business mind usually end up being the ones that lead the lead the process.
Yeah, I've heard people, filmmakers, say that somewhere in the last 20 years, it like notes from the studio went from being like, oh God, I got notes, I guess I have to look at them, to like, okay, let me look at these notes. Wow, there's actually some constructive ideas in here. Like some
Yeah.
of these ideas are actually useful. And then you look to some extent, at what Marvel has done, which Warner Brothers and DC started to follow when they gave Wonder Woman to Patty Jenkins.
Mhm.
Is they take these great directors, like if you've seen Nomadland,
I have not.
from Chloe Zhao, what she did with that movie makes me super excited for Eternals, and I've never read an Eternals comic book in my entire life. I
Oh,
don't
wow.
know any of these characters, right? But she's a fantastic director. They're giving her a crew and a cast that are going to let her, I assume, do great things. The same thing with Guardians of the Galaxy. When they put out Guardians of the Galaxy, I was like, I don't know. I know maybe a couple of these actors, at least the ones on screen. Like, I didn't really know Chris Pratt at the time. I knew we had Bradley Cooper playing a talking raccoon, but it worked. And that's one of the things that I think they have a process that prioritizes creativity. And maybe they're not putting out, Oscar-winning Godfather and like The Sting level movies,
Mhm.
but they have elevated the action movie a step above kind of the Michael Bay Independence Day level films that were coming out.
Yeah,
And I
it's
know
definitely
people are going to be like, "Oh my God, what's he saying about Independence Day?" I'm like, it wasn't a great movie. I'm sorry. I loved it. It's fun, but it's not great.
yeah, it was definitely a fun one because I even to this day still think about it. Like when all that UFO stuff started coming out last week, I was like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, they were onto something with Independence Day. But also, technology is creeping into other parts of this process as well. And I was reading some reporting done by The Verge, and a couple different companies here I wanted to address. One is a company called Scriptbook, which is screenwriting and storytelling, but basically, Scriptbook provides artificial intelligence that does script analysis, and then it has AI driven content validation and automated story generation. What do you think about that? Is that possible? Really?
I think it's possible. I think we're like 50 years away from it being like a full blown process. I mean, you look at what the art that Deep Dream puts out, Google's AI platform, and you're like, "Well, this is good. Honestly, this is
Yeah.
good. Like, this is better than quite a lot of things that you might see at a modern art exhibit." So it can be done, and I don't see why it can't. I mean, artificial intelligence is still intelligence. It'll eventually get there, but for the time being, number one, it still needs to fit into a process that probably involves a lot of other humans. You need script editors, you need the studios, you need actors that are involved, like all of that process. I think actually one of the things that might, once you get past kind of the automation of logistics planning, I think that's one of the places where it's going to have its biggest impact first. You probably are going to see some elements of like some of the script writing getting automated, especially honestly, you look at most of the movies out there and just the nature of storytelling. It's kind of by default somewhat formulaic. And every now and then you have some visionaries like Akira Kurosawa and Menken Roshamon who are able to chop up the structure into a different way, or even like Pulp Fiction, right? But at the same time, you can disassemble Pulp Fiction and just edit together in a different way, and it becomes very conventional.
Mm-hmm.
So in a lot of ways, it's variations on a theme. It's, you're taking from what's been done before. There's almost no story where somebody will say, this takes from that movie. And then you look at that movie and like, yeah, this movie took from an earlier movie. And you can just go back and further and further and further, almost the beginning of time. But you're probably going to need somebody who really understands the human connection, who is going to take a look at that first draft, that treatment, and be able to transform it into something that an audience can really connect with and understand.
I agree. I think that's going to be a real interesting step forward. And I'm excited to actually see some of the output, like where it is right now. And I saw some stuff actually that was generated automatically for storytelling about 3 or 4 years ago. And it's pretty good. It was like, it told a very basic story of the system, but it kind of looked at how stories were written, and then it created its own story. And there was definitely like issues and mistakes and that kind of stuff in there, but it was like kind of on the right path,
Yeah.
Some of the other companies that are kind of popping up is there's a company called like Pilot, and it uses data to kind of forecast box office revenue up to like 18 months out. So it looks at all kinds of different factors and tries to help you predict how much money you're going to make before the film even comes out. And then there's a company called Vault, and it predicts like which demographics will watch films based on tracking kind of among other things, trailers and other information that's online. I mean, all this is, like you said before, like super helpful for marketing and business, right? Like trying to figure out, where do I put this film? When do I do it? What is the date in which I should drop it out? What time of day is the most successful time for my film? Like just having that information to help with marketing.
Yeah. And for sure, as far as like, especially when you get into target marketing or picking out a tone for marketing, if it's going to be somebody who's younger, who's interested in more modern music or more unique storylines, more action, then you can market to that. If it's someone who's maybe a little bit older, who's more interested in like introspective films or something that's going to be slower paced, then you can market it that way. That makes a huge difference. It really does. And I bet you could talk to somebody at YouTube who basically knows all of this information, because they know who, anonymized data. They're looking at the demographics, but they know who's watching what trailers and who's upvoting and downvoting.
Yeah. If you want to talk about the most powerful analytics data in the entire world, just look at YouTube, right? I mean, they pretty much know what everybody's doing at all times, what they're interested in, what excites them, how many times they've watched it. There's just so much data there, but these companies that are popping up that are trying to help non-YouTube companies have to scrape that data off the net somewhere, right? And I just called it the net. I just called it the internet. The net reminds me of what it was is we were doing all this research on this as a side note, and what popped up was the net. Remember with Sandra Bullock?
Sandra Bullock. Yeah, that movie was terrible.
Yeah, it was terrible. You go rewatch it and you're like, whoa, this is like not good. Although they were kind of on to a couple things when it came to data security and stuff, and how like all these systems are interconnected and everything. It was kind of interesting. When you
it's one of
go
those
rewatch
examples
it.
of how a broken clock is right twice a day.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But I want to talk finally about this area that you and I have debated for a long time, which is AI actors.
Mm-hmm.
So in the show Entourage, if you remember, because we both watched it, there was a scene with James Cameron, and he's standing there with Eric, or E, they call him in the show, and they're chatting about animatronic seahorses for this movie that's being made, Aquaman. And he turns and he looks at Eric and he says, well, in 5 years, we won't even need actors anymore. And then Eric looks all nervous and he goes, I'm just kidding. Well, and I remember
It's a funny
thinking about
beat.
that scene. What's that?
I said it's a funny beat.
It is a funny beat, and I started thinking about it just because he ends up doing the movie Avatar and that kind of stuff. And I
Hmm.
started thinking about it, and I go, well, is what are the components that would make a human connect with a non-human? And really, it has to do with behavior, right? So, like, we already connect with non-humans. There's already characters in video games and other places where we just love those characters, and they're not humans. That may be modeled after them, but how far off are we to get to a point where we create a non-human that is not necessarily modeled off of our behavior, that we connect with and we fall in love with, and we want to see them movie after movie after movie, where we hire them, quote unquote hire them, to act in these movies, just like we would hire a normal actor, right? It's a
Well, I think it's important to take into account that so you have the CGI presentation of the performance,
Yeah.
but what really made these CGI characters, I wouldn't call them AI characters at this point. They probably will potentially be sometime in the future. But what these CGI characters are presenting to us is a performance that was designed and captured by an actor or an animator at the very least, right? So actors do two things typically, right? They design the performance, right? They establish the character and they design the performance around the character, and then they perform it. So within kind of the CGI process that resulted in Avatar, that still happened. You still had these actors like Sigourney Weaver designing what her performance was going to be and performing it with these performance capture suits, right? That actually look at your eyes and look at your mouth, and they're strapped to you so you can move around and you can actually act out the performance. And then they're using that in order to basically put that performance onto this CGI rendered character. So all of this facial expressions, the tonality, everything is still there. It all came from an actor. And one of the things that anybody can look up is for The Last of Us, the actors who portrayed Joel and Ellie, the characters in that video game, were Troy Baker and Ashley Johnson. And you can look up on YouTube them actually in these performance capture suits, in these performance capture kind of green screen or blue screen soundstage, performing what's in the film
Mhm.
or it's in the game. And that's right now how it's done. And even if you get to a full AI character or actor, they are still going to have to, the AI is going to have to design that performance, which means they're going to have to look back, they're going to have to understand the character, they're going to have to understand the emotionality of it, which honestly AI will eventually be able to do, right? We're going to have what's called effective computing, where technology is going to be able to take the emotional reactions of the consumer into account when performing, whenever making any kind of design or product decisions, right? And that's just coming. It's going to happen. But that's not where we are now. And the reality is that I don't know that the industry is ever going to make the choice to employ that to the extent that they're not using human actors,
Mhm.
because when you, at that point, how do you get the variability of making these characters feel different from each other, as
Mhm.
opposed to, every villain feels like the same villain.
Well, I was thinking about this and I thought, let's say you're the company that creates the suits that we're all getting into, and then we're acting, and then it's creating this animated character, right? Over time, you're going to have a tremendous amount of data on body movement. What happens when Demetrius throws a punch at me and I move away, or I leap, or I jump? You have every little nuance of how the knee moves, the elbow moves, the
Mm-hmm.
ankle moves, right? And if you took that data and then you interpolated that data more smoothly into non-conforming actions, like what I mean by that is, like, if you told the system, I want you to move like an action hero, you have 100 different actors that have put in that were action heroes that have put in all of their data from the films that were made, and now you have these 10 million data points. I want you to act like an actor, but not copy any one of them. I want you to blend all that together, or I want you to take 10% of one and 20% of the other. I wonder if you would get a really interesting output that people would connect with.
Well, I mean, you can create the animation. You can absolutely capture like how. I mean, that's not new either, right? You can watch Cowboy Bebop, right?
Uh-huh.
If you haven't seen Cowboy Bebop, you have to watch Cowboy Bebop. It's 26 half-hour episodes. The fantastic story about how it was made, where they composed all the music first, and then they wrote the stories and everything around the music. But they have fantastic action scenes, and this was like, I think, the mid '90s, maybe the late '90s. They
Uh-huh.
weren't doing a whole lot of. They just weren't doing performance capture. They might have been a little bit of motion capture at the time, but the way that the action scenes are animated together is very, very compelling. But at the same time, you still had an animator who was designing the performance. Because when you have like an action star who's moving, it's not just that you have realistic movement in the animation. It's also the little things that, Bruce Lee would do in the way that he would throw his punch. Or, I mean, you go back and watch Enter the Dragon, and he's not always throwing like textbook perfect punches. He's performing in the action scene in order to create an emotion and an impression in the viewer.
Mm-hmm.
So those are all things that still needs to happen. And maybe an AI will be able to do it at some point when they get to the point where they really understand human emotion and how to portray that.
Yeah.
But right now, you still need an animator. If it's not an actor, then you need an animator who's designing that performance. So like, when is our action hero pausing in the action to take a breath, or to emphasize this strike, or to show that his knees hurt, or something. All these things that kind of communicate about this character.
Yeah. I just don't think that we're that far off from these AI systems improvising.
Improvising, yeah, they can totally improvise, but improvising within the character, I think, is going to be more challenging. And
It is.
improvising within the character to make good creative decisions, I think we're decades out from that. And there's a huge question of what is going to happen once effective computing gets employed. Are AIs going to start experiencing emotion, or at least something that's indistinguishable from emotion?
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of questions about what happens when we get there.
It's true, but like when you were talking about your example of Google system, creating their own paintings and things like that, that's kind of what I was thinking of, where it's like,
Yeah.
okay, well, I know how humans tend to move during an action scene. Maybe I'll improvise here. Maybe I'll improvise there. Maybe the system is just playing around on its own because we give it the space to do so, right?
Yeah,
And
it
I
can become a part of it for sure.
yeah, and I think that will be really, really cool. And at the end of the day, I think what it comes down to is building these human-like relationships with these characters, right? Because like one of the points that was made in the articles that I was reading about prior to the podcast was that actors are really expensive. It's like one of the most expensive parts of filmmaking, right? There are
Yeah.
films that don't happen because they just can't get what they believe are the right actors, just because they can't pay them to do the film, right? And so at some point, someone's going to say, well, maybe we won't use them. We'll just use the avatar version of them, right?
I mean, well, here's the thing, dude. Those actors, you have to look at why those actors cost so much. And those actors cost so much because of their brand and their draw. It's not necessarily because actors inherently cost a lot. If you wanted to get you can go out there and hire a much cheaper actor and you could probably find a much cheaper actor who is close to, if not the same, or even a better actor, right? Like we mentioned Tom Cruise before. I think Tom Cruise is a very capable actor, but he's not. Michael B. Jordan is a much better actor, honestly. And I know if Tom Cruise hears this, which he probably won't, he might be offended. But the reality is there are, or you look at Anthony Hopkins, right? We were talking before this about if AI was doing all the casting, they would have said, let's forget this Anthony Hopkins guy. Let's throw Tom Cruise in Silence of the Lambs.
Mm-hmm.
The reality is Anthony Hopkins costs less than Tom Cruise. And regardless of whether or not they could be an equivalent level of acting talent, but he was still the right actor for that role. So when you get into AI, one of two things is going to happen. They're not going to go with that AI actor because it doesn't have the box office draw of like a Tom Cruise or a Will Smith or something like that. Or if they do have the box office draw, then whoever owns the IP for that AI actor is gonna charge for it.
That's what
So,
I was thinking,
yeah,
right? Are we going to get to the point where it's like, oh, Demetrius's corporation that makes AI actors will license you that
mhm.
particular actor, and it's going to cost you,
The same amount as
75%.
getting
Yeah.
Tom Cruise.
Yeah, totally. Right. Or
Yeah,
75% of it or something so that you're, always you're always in consideration or something. But like, yeah, you're right. Like it unfolds it because I mean, they're already doing that with robots now. Right. So like, for
yeah.
example, this is a little side note, but there's like these robotic companies where they will take these robots to walk around buildings and stuff and do security, kind of like mall security.
Hmm.
And you pay them hourly, just like you would pay a normal human being
Yeah,
hourly to do security.
yeah. And honestly, for a security application, it's better. I think I was a security guard in college.
Yeah.
Um, when you go through the security guard training, right? You have to do that in order to get your guard card. So
Yeah.
you have to get registered and stuff. The training, for the most part, is for the love of God, if anything happens, don't do anything.
Yep.
You are not there to secure the facility.
Yeah.
You are there to reduce our insurance premiums.
Yep.
So that's why the whole like observe and report became the mantra. And I think there's even a movie called Observe and Report, which kind of pokes fun at it. But yeah, you're just there to kind of fill a seat. You keep your eyes open. And what we know about like humans' ability to maintain vigilance when there's no threat for hours on end, you get really bored. I learned how to balance a pencil on standing up and stuff like that. Just takes a lot of patience.
Exactly.
Yeah, security cameras, especially AI enhanced security cameras that can find motion and figure out what they're looking at with like semantic processing and stuff. They are going to be a ton better than humans for that application. For acting, for making creative decisions, a painting is not a hour and a half to 2 hour film. Like a painting is a moment in time. So for Deep Dream to go from creating a painting that I look at and think that's really good and another person might not, to creating an hour and a half to 2 hour film, that's a huge leap. Even today, you hear filmmakers saying, the fact that any film comes together and is successful and works is a minor miracle in itself because of all the moving parts that are involved. Like
And
for
it's
an
also
AI to
what
take over for hundreds, sometimes thousands of people that are involved in this, it's a big step.
And that's what makes it all very interesting too, in my opinion, right? Is that it's hard. It's challenging. And then when it works and it's a breakthrough film and people love it, it feels good because it took both business, creative, technology, everything in order to delight people for like 2 hours. I mean, it's everything that we work on, basically. Experience. How do you create amazing experiences for people? Well, let's wrap up with predictions for the future. So I want to make one statement here. One of the things that I've learned from you over time, the last 15 years we've worked together, is that when it comes to technology, it's not a one or a zero. It isn't whether it works or doesn't work. It's more of like, how do you make it helpful for your process? And that's one of the things. I think it's a natural change and a natural progression for Hollywood to start to adopt more technology. And I think it'll be really interesting to see who leads the pack when it comes to applying technology appropriately and creating amazing films.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
The other thing I wanted to mention was I think Hollywood is less of like a destination to produce a film and more of like a place to be inspired. I love Hollywood, and the things that I love about it are the like-minded creative people that are there, the fact that you see billboards everywhere with like movies on them, and you see the Hollywood sign, and you can go into any Coffee Bean or Starbucks or coffee store around there, and you'll see tons of people on their laptops, writing scripts and writing ideas and that kind of stuff. I think it's a great place to like find talent and get enthused and be excited, but it isn't necessarily the destination to produce films anymore. And I think that's okay. And that's kind of the way Silicon Valley is becoming. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think that if you go to LA and you spend time with the people who live there, you start to realize how much the creative lifeblood of film is not necessarily invested in these studios. It's invested of kind of like the culture of LA, where the vast majority of people there, it's kind of like, Silicon Valley. Most of the people that you meet are at some point working in tech, and that includes people like us who are looking at data and making research decisions and things like that. There are visual designers. There's a lot of artists. You have social scientists. You have engineers. But everybody is kind of like wrapped into this culture of developing technological products or just technology in general. You go and talk to people in LA, and so many people are integrated into the culture of making films, right? And so much artistry there. There's so much artistry in LA. There's so many people that I know who move to LA, who live in LA, who are doing visual effects or doing practical effects, who are screenwriters or script editors or all these kinds of things. And I think that is the elements of Hollywood that kind of make it what it is the people who live there are so ingrained into the filmmaking process. I think that when it comes to producing film, like leveraging the talent within that community is going to be huge. But at the same time, we as industries in general are becoming more decentralized. And we saw this, if you go back to the 1950s, all of the best movies were coming out of Japan, right?
Mm-hmm.
You had Akira Kurosawa, you had Yasujiro Ozu, you had Kon Ichikawa. They were all making fantastic, amazing movies that then influenced the next generation of American filmmakers like George Lucas and Steven Spielberg and Martin Scorsese. So I think what could be really interesting that technology can help to facilitate is this cross-pollination of cinema across different communities, both in the US and across the world. Like you've seen some of these directors coming out of places like South Africa or India, China, all over the place. Mexico, we've seen, I think, 3 out of the last 5 best film Oscar winners were from Mexico, and then you had one from Korea. So it's everything's moving much more international, and I think that the possibilities for everybody to kind of work together across language barriers, across distance, is very, very exciting. And I think it's one of the ways that technology can have the hugest impact on top of the logistics planning and getting all the logistics worked out for film production.
Very well said, my friend. All right, I think this is a wrap for today's episode. This was fun, man. I'm glad we did this, and I think this is one of those ones I'd like to do a follow up on, maybe a deep dive into the actor AI stuff as it continues to unfold. Maybe we'll follow some of those companies that we talked about and just kind of see where things go. So for everyone who's listening, please follow us on Twitter, as well as share this episode with a friend. We have been growing and we're super excited about it, and we want to continue to do more and more shows. So thank you all, and we'll see you all next week.